Victorian taxpayers will be forced to pay for Scotland to host the 2026 Commonwealth Games after, of course, the Victorian government canned them last year. You'll remember the then Premier, Daniel Andrews, was all smiles when he launched the Games in 2022. Here's a reminder.
That is fantastic news for every Victorian, for our state. These will be a Commonwealth Games like no other. This is also about creating jobs, nearly 4,000 jobs during the Commonwealth Games, some 3,000 enduring jobs thereafter.
What a farce. After the election, he scrapped the Games. The whole debacle has cost the state $600 million. And a little earlier, tennis legend turned politician Sam Groth shared his disappointment with me about this debacle.
Chris, first of all, thank you for having me on. And as you mentioned, yes, this is great for the Commonwealth Games as a sporting event. It's great that it's going to find a new home. But from an athlete's point of view, and especially from an Australian athlete's point of view, and I'd also say from a Victorian's point of view, it's disappointing that these games aren't going to be held as they were supposed to here in regional Victoria or in Victoria as a whole. I'm sure on the back of what was an unbelievable Olympic Games for all of those Australian athletes. The next big thing they would have been looking forward to in 2 years' time was to have a Games here in Australia, and unfortunately now that's not going to be the case.
Yeah, absolutely. Imagine that. All these heroes that we've seen at the Olympics, we could have been looking forward to them in regional Victoria in 2026. It's a tragedy for the country. It's embarrassing for Australia, but especially for Victorian taxpayers. What about the sting in the tail? And that is the compensation the Victorian taxpayers have paid to the Commonwealth Games Association will now be used by Glasgow to put on the Games. They reckon they can put on the Games for nothing, essentially just using Victoria's money.
It's an incredible scenario we find ourselves in now, Chris, as we speak about this. The proposal put forward by Glasgow by the Commonwealth Games Scotland will receive what looks like 100 million plus pounds of the money that was used to cancel the Commonwealth Games, part of that $380 million settlement that was paid to the Commonwealth Games Federation. Scotland is now saying they can host a Games that will cost their taxpayers nothing, their ratepayers nothing, and deliver, yes, a reduced Games in scale. But when you think about what the Victorian government, then the Premier Daniel Andrews and Jacinta Allen, who is now the Premier, who was in charge of Commonwealth Games delivery at the time, they came up with a costing of close to $7 billion to run this Games in regional Victoria. But the other part that they came up with was a $4 billion cost if they were to move it back to Melbourne. You got to remember, we call ourselves the sporting capital of the nation down here in Melbourne, in Victoria, and of course we are, but we have some incredible assets, the MCG, MSAC, 3 indoor stadiums at Melbourne Park, as well as the other things, the other facilities we have right around the city. There's no reason this Games couldn't have been brought back to Melbourne at a reduced cost. We've spent $600 million total in cancelling. If Glasgow can run it at a cost of around 200 million Australian dollars, why couldn't we here in Victoria run the Games at a reduced cost, similar to what they're doing in Glasgow, that still would have delivered a benefit for the state?
It is so logical, yet what's happening seems so insane, Sam, because Victoria's effectively paid $300 million not to put on the Games.
Yeah, $380 million was the payment to the Commonwealth Games Federation to break that contract. Over $200 million in other costs that have gone in the early preparation. Now, Jacinta Allen and her government still spruik that they're going to pump a whole bunch of money into regional Victoria, which is fine. You know, we want to see investment in those regions, but we could have held an event here in Melbourne and actually used that event. We don't do this very well. I've got tourism as part of my portfolio as well as sport and events, Chris. We need to be able to leverage our major events here in Melbourne to get people out to the regions. So when they come for the Australian Open or the Grand Prix, or when they should have been coming for the Commonwealth Games, use those events to actually push people to visit the rest of Victoria. It's a missed opportunity for Jacinta Allen, for her government down here, and it's an embarrassment now for Victoria. And I will just make one other point, Chris. If you can run a Commonwealth Games in Glasgow for around 200 million Australian dollars, the government here saying it was going to cost $4 billion. If you are looking to run an event in Victoria, you will now be questioning the cost that this government puts forward every single time you propose a new event here and wonder whether you can do it cheaper elsewhere.
Yeah, fair point. Of course, the latest bit is the Victorian government wants to run the gay and lesbian games. Now, I'm not certain really what they are. I don't quite understand that, because I love to watch athletes in all sorts of sports, and I don't care whether they're gay, lesbian, heterosexual. I just don't know, and I don't care. I don't see why we have to have separate games for people based on their sexuality.
Look, I think that's so great about the Olympic Games, about the Commonwealth Games. It's inclusive to all. But I will say, just on the gay games, Chris, it should have been an addition to our calendar. If we were in a position where we were managing our major events calendar, our sporting calendar as a whole well here in Victoria, then an addition of something else would be fantastic. But at the moment, when you can't get your current calendar in order, when you can't manage the events that you've already committed funds to, you've got to be questioning whether this government should be pitching for any event in the future. We want to see our major events here, a sustainable major events calendar. But at the moment, we get a government that's happy to celebrate renewing events, like we saw recently with the Boxing Day test. We've got to keep seeing our major events calendar reinvigorated, revitalised. And, it's got to support the rest of the sector as well.
Well said, Sam. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Chris.